Welcome back to the home ground. Well, to great expense to the taxpayer, the Melbourne Metro Tunnel has opened in Victoria, $15 billion in total, Max Schiffman. Is the hype matched by the potential benefits to this state?
Look, it's been really interesting seeing how excited people are about a new tunnel and some trains running through it. I've never seen anything quite like this. A lot of excitement. I learned a new word as well, gunzel. That's your sort of railway expert, maybe a bit like a train spotter might have been in the UK. So a lot of excitement, big opening. They're running free public transport for the next few months as well on weekends to get people to use it. And people are very excited. It is a huge piece of infrastructure. It really cuts some of those travel times through the middle of the city from some of the lines on either side in Pakenham and Sunbury. So it is a huge project. Architecturally, it's meant to be very beautiful as well. But the question is, has all this effort been worthwhile?
Okay, just for the layperson and for me too, it obviously connects the university sector to the middle of Melbourne, but from a structural and transport point of view, where else does it connect? Like, where is the connection?
Yeah, so it makes a connection right through the centre of the CBD. So it's 9 kilometres of new tunnel and 5 new stations, which end at Domain, which is just a very sort of top end of St Kilda Road at the very southern portion, and you go through to Parkville and Arden, which are precincts to the north with stops along the way. So it's more of a capacity increase for the whole network because the city loop was getting congested,
Right.
and so now certain trains can bypass the city loop, which creates more capacity outside.
Okay, how does it compare to the Sydney Metro? Because obviously that was open with great fanfare and very positive response as well to that.
Yeah, I mean, the response in Sydney, and that was opened last year, was enormous as well. I think if you contrast the two projects, I mean, both have been very expensive, very elongated, both went over budget. But if you look at the city shaping capacity of both, for me, it's unquestionable that the Sydney Metro makes a much bigger difference to travel patterns and land use patterns across Sydney, particularly through the west, than what the Melbourne Metro Tunnel will.
Okay, every infrastructure project has a cost blowout. It's global now because obviously the cost of doing business, materials and labour and so forth. So we're looking at what, mid 10 billions to out to 15 billion. I saw your LinkedIn post. Is that a reasonable cost blowout? And how do you sort of balance that between the benefits?
Yeah, it's a funny way to put it, right? What's a reasonable cost blowout? But they are all in the billions. Pretty much any infrastructure project in Australia and indeed around the world seems to go materially over what is projected, either in time or cost, and usually both. So, yeah, Metro Tunnel, the sort of median cost estimate back when the business case was done was 10.9 billion, and it's ending up costing about 15.5 once you include the capital cost plus all the things that make it happen, like the financing and contracting costs, if you like. And so that's a 42% increase. It's not a small amount. Now, it did get built through the pandemic, which made it very difficult. I suppose the lucky thing for the Metro Tunnel is a very large portion of it was built before you had that massive cost inflation from the pandemic. So the impacts of the blowouts were less than what they otherwise might have been. So if it had only started post-pandemic, it probably would have been double the cost as opposed to only 42%. But the key thing becomes a question of, does it actually stack up at the end of the day? And so many of these infrastructure projects, in fact, pretty much every infrastructure project in Australia will go through some sort of cost-benefit analysis where they work out that, for the money that you're spending today, what sort of economic benefits will it bring down track? And so that's everything from, direct impacts like people using the train network more, so you get your fare revenue. It's things like what can you do around the land when new stations are in terms of development opportunity. There's a benefit there. There's the cost savings or improvements to the broader network, so that gets included. And then there are these things called wider economic benefits, which are sort of the intangibles, and it's a bit of a term of art as to how you work that out. So, for example, they assume that in the case of a CBD, when you've got better transport, more businesses will set up there, more workers will come and commute in because it's easier to get in, and so you get this thing called agglomeration benefit, which basically means more businesses in the same place. They all feed off each other effectively and create a greater output than they otherwise otherwise would have. So there are all these things that filter into these cost-benefit analyses.
And the wider economic benefit, correct me if I'm wrong, the politicians use that as a little bit of a wider palette to fill the colours and sell it to the electorate. Is that right?
Yeah, sometimes that's right. I mean, they talk about a lot of intangibles, and we've got to have a way of being able to weigh up what the best spend for an infrastructure project is, because the thing about economics or the economy is it's all about trade-offs. There's never going to be enough money to do everything. There's never enough people to do everything. And so you've got to make smart decisions around, well, where do you invest the time and money and effort? And so the cost-benefit analysis is one of the ways you do that, where you go, there's a universe of projects we could be delivering. How do we assess which is going to give us the best return on the big investment from the taxpayer relative to all the others? And that's where the cost benefit can come into it. Now, one of the challenges we have is once your costs blow out, then all the costs go up. And even if your benefits remain steady state, the fact that your costs are higher mean that the return you're getting for that investment is lower.
Okay, Max, did I read this correctly? The drop-off of public transport use after the pandemic hasn't really returned, has it? As in, it hasn't regenerated the usage of public transport. Do you think the Metro Tunnel will alleviate that issue?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question and something that I think all people interested in infrastructure and the way cities grow will be watching. At the moment, public transport ridership in Melbourne remains about 23% below the pre-pandemic level. And that's off the backdrop of, 5.5 years of population growth. So we've got a lot more people in Melbourne, yet overall usage is still 23% lower. Now, you can imagine a lot of these business cases, they assume that public ridership is going to keep growing. So when you've got a day one reduction of 23% on your ridership, that's going to have a pretty material impact on a lot of the assumptions around the benefits of these projects. Now, to be fair, when Metro was started, it was before the pandemic. We still had everyone working in the office. We didn't have work from home and hybrid the way we did. So, I think the work was done in good faith at the time. But learning what we know now about, the modern workplace and flexibility and all those things, it does have to then feed into how we assess other transport projects and make decisions around those.
Okay, and that's a really good segue, because I saw a politician who maybe remains nameless because I can't remember them, or maybe I want to forget them. Who knows? But either or, saying this is the link to the next big infrastructure project, which is, where's the drum roll?
The suburban rail loop.
Or the train station.
Oh, the train station.
To the airport.
There's many.
Which this city, this Melbourne, absolutely needs. If it's a serious international city, try to tell me that doesn't need to happen next.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at the list of priorities, I think people would mostly agree that a train link to the CBD is most pressing for an international city like Melbourne. And in fact, I was reminded reading some of the articles over the weekend around Melbourne Metro that some of the promises from the former Premier, Daniel Andrews, at the time was that the airport link would be under construction by the time the Metro was complete. Now, that obviously hasn't happened. All the plans around the airport link have been, let's say, revised, because at that time there was no such thing as a suburban rail loop. But now the the city to airport link has been included as part of one of the stages of suburban rail loop, albeit quite a way down the track. And so it just means that key link is not going to be delivered for much longer than what was promised.
Okay, how and I realise we're in a parlous economic state in Victoria, but how long can that can be kept kicked along the road? How can this be delayed any longer if you're not going to connect all the dots?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, you need a public transport network that is interconnected. Otherwise, it doesn't really operate efficiently. And so you've again got all these competing interests for a state government that is really drowning under debt at the moment. And debt is an important thing. Some people say, what's the difference? But it just means that the more we build things that go over budget, the more taxes have to go up, or the more we have to spend less on other sort of key services that people need, and it gets to a point where the interest bill starts to override what you're spending on sort of core things. And so you've got this current direction, which is ploughing a lot of money into the suburban rail loop as the next major infrastructure project. That's going to be connecting Box Hill to Cheltenham, and it's kicked off now and will, is intended to be open by 2035. And the question for me becomes, well, what other parts of the network or what other infrastructure projects could we have been looking at instead, and would they have been a better answer to the needs of current Victorians and future Victorians of perhaps that particular project? One of the real laments about Suburban Rail Loop is it never went through that sort of formal assessment process when it was announced. There have been business cases done subsequent. I don't think that's the way we should be making decisions around major infrastructure projects, especially ones which will, keep the capacity of other things to be built diminished for the next decade or more.
Okay, when you look, we can reflect on the metro tunnel being opened. In hindsight, and it is a powerful weapon, would you have liked to see the airport link being the first part of the puzzle and not an afterthought like it is at the moment?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, the whole west of Melbourne needs a bit more investment, from an infrastructure perspective. Not only do we need a proper airport train link, which I think is essential and should be happening sooner rather than later, but, we've still got people in growth suburbs that are taking V-lines, and these are effectively metropolitan suburbs through, towards Melton and Truganina and so forth. So that, to me, seems like a pretty high priority given the amount of infrastructure you need is relatively small compared to the cost of some of these other mega projects. But what it would do to the capacity of these existing suburbs would be extraordinary in terms of the return, in my view.
And I'm not asking you to be a political analyst, maybe I am, but this seems to be a tremendous piece of timing for Jacinta Allen's government in a sense that she's now starting to ramp up the rhetoric of an election with a new opposition leader. So how much of a benefit will that be in a sense that if the public gives it the tick of approval, the Metro Tunnel?
Yeah, look, one thing the current Victorian government can certainly point to is they've built a lot of stuff. That's a separate question to whether it was built the right way, on budget. Was it the right choice of spending taxpayer money? But certainly it's hard to argue with the fact that you go and check out Anzac Station or Domain Station, and they've built some really significant things. I think people going into the next election will be thinking about, well, did they get something out of it? Has their local area received the infrastructure and investment that they've needed? That's going to be the thing they weigh up. Like, yes, it's great to have these big things that, make sweeping moves across, the fabric of Melbourne, but is it doing enough to enhance the livability day to day for, many local other areas? I'm not sure, and I think that's one of the things they'll be judging upon.
Are you encouraged or dubious with the opposition musings about maybe trimming sales tax on new developments, stamp duty and so forth, reducing the cost of housing in this state? Do you think they are political catch cries, or do you think they are based in reality?
We have a housing sector that's really struggling in Victoria, and if the housing sector is struggling, as in the builders, developers, financiers, everyone involved in the process, then the new housing we need doesn't get built. So I think we do need to look at a whole series of incentives or stimulus around getting new housing happening. I don't necessarily mean it has to be granting money to builders or developers that are doing these sorts of things, but anything you can do to reduce some of the friction of buying a new home and make it cost comparable with other alternatives, I think would be helpful. Certainly putting incentives around off the plan again, which has been put in temporarily by the current government, but extending that further or increasing the thresholds, I think would be highly valuable and would probably lead to more homes being built on average. But we still have some pretty fundamental core challenges around the housing sector across the country in terms of feasibility and cost. But I think that's particularly acute in Victoria, where over time, that sort of mantle of being the place where the most homes are being built, which has been the truth for the last little while, I think that's going to start to diminish because the market here has been incredibly tough, and in my view remains tougher than pretty much any other jurisdiction in the country.
But finally, Max, do you think that the Liberals are testing the temperature as far as how far they can push what they believe to be reasonable housing reform and reduce the cost and see it as a political tool to get back into government, or do you think there's something else at play?
there's no question to me that housing will be one of the most significant issues leading into not only the next Victorian state election, but pretty much every election for the foreseeable future around the country. I haven't seen enough yet out of the Liberal Party to know what their policies are. They haven't sort of come out with a fulsome housing and planning policy yet, but no doubt that'll be a fierce battleground for all parties over the next 12 months and beyond. So I'm keen to see what they come up with and whether it'll make more practical on the ground sense than a lot of the headline planning that I've seen from the current state government.
Okay, maybe we should get the opposition leader on the home ground. What do you reckon?
Maybe we'll get the opposition leader and we'll try ask the Premier as well, see what happens.
Good on you, Max.
Good to see you, Bash.
Catch you soon.